getting enough to eat, or whether we should be spending money on medical research. So they've got a particular view of what government should do and should be. And that view was rejected by the American people when it was debated during the presidential campaign. I think every poll that's out there indicates that the American people actually think our commitment to Medicare or to education is really important, and that's something that we should look at as a last resort in terms of reducing the deficit. And it makes a lot more sense for us to close, for example, corporate loopholes before we go to putting a bigger burden on students or seniors. But if the House Republicans disagree with that and they want to shut down the government to see if they can get their way on it, that's their prerogative. That's how the system's set up. It will damage our economy. The government is a big part of this economy. And it's interesting that a lot of times you have people who recognize that when it comes to defense spending. Some of the same folks who say we got to cut spending or complain that government jobs don't do anything, when it comes to that defense contractor in their district, they think, wow, this is a pretty important part of the economy in my district. We shouldn't stop spending on that. Let's just make sure we're not spending on those other folks.
So would you give a chance that you fail to come to an agreement with the Republicans on this and the country come to
Look, my hope is that common sense prevails. That's always my preference, and I think that would be the preference of the American people, and that's what would be good for the economy. So let me just repeat. If the issue is deficit reduction, getting our deficits sustainable over time, getting our debt in a sustainable place, then Democrats and Republicans in Congress will have a partner with me. We can achieve that, and we can achieve it fairly quickly. I mean, we know what the numbers are. We know what needs to be done. We know what a balanced approach would take. We've already done probably more than half of the deficit reduction we need to stabilize the debt and the deficit. There's probably been more pain and drama in getting there than we needed. And so finishing the job shouldn't be that difficult if everybody comes to the conversation with an open mind, and if we recognize that there's some things, like not paying our bills, that should be out of bounds. All right, I'm going to take one last question. Jackie Combs. Yep.
I'd like to ask you, now that you've reached the end of your first term, starting your second, about a couple of criticisms, one that's longstanding, another more recent. The longstanding one seems to have become a truism of sorts, that you and your staff are too insular, that you don't socialize enough. And the second, the more recent criticism, is that your team taking shape isn't as diverse as it could be, or even was, in terms of getting additional voices, gender, race, ethnic diversity. So I'd like you to address both of those.
Sure. Let me take the second one first. I'm very proud that in the first 4 years we had as diverse, if not more diverse, a White House and a cabinet than any in history. And I intend to continue that, because it turns out that when you look for the very best people, given the incredible diversity of this country, you're going to end up with a diverse staff and a diverse team, and that very diversity helps to create more effective policy making and better decision making for me, because it brings different perspectives to the table. So if you think about my first 4 years, the person who probably had the most influence on my foreign policy was a woman. The people who were in charge of moving forward my most important domestic initiative, healthcare, were women. The person in charge of our homeland security was a woman. My 2 appointments to the Supreme Court were women, and 50% of my White House staff were women. So I think people should expect that that record will be built upon during the next 4 years. Now, what I've made 4 appointments so far, and one woman, admittedly a high-profile one, is leaving the administration, has already left the administration, and I have made a replacement. But I would just suggest that everybody kind of wait until they've seen all my appointments, who's in the White House staff and who's in my cabinet, before they rush to judgment.
Big three.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying, Jackie, is that I think until you've seen what my overall team looks like, it's premature to assume that somehow we're going backwards. We're not going backwards, we're going forward. With respect to this truism about me not socializing enough and patting folks on the back and all that stuff, most people who know me know I'm a pretty friendly guy. And I like a good party. And, the truth is that, when I was in the Senate, I had great relationships over there, and up until the point that I became president, this was not an accusation that you heard very frequently. I think that really what's gone on in terms of some of the paralysis here in Washington, or difficulties in negotiations, just have to do with some very stark differences in terms of policy. Some very sharp differences in terms of where we stand on issues. And, if you think about, let's say, myself and Speaker Boehner, I like Speaker Boehner personally. And, when we went out and played golf, we had a great time, but that didn't get a deal done in 2011. When I'm over here at the congressional picnic and folks are coming up and taking pictures with their family, I promise you, Michelle and I are very nice to them, and we have a wonderful time. But it doesn't prevent them from going under the floor of the House and, blasting me for being a big spending socialist. And the reason that, in many cases, Congress votes the way they do, or talks the way they talk, or takes positions in negotiations that they take, doesn't have to do with me. It has to do with the imperatives that they feel in terms of their own politics, right? They're worried about their district. They're worried about what's going on back home. I think there are a lot of Republicans at this point that feel that, given how much energy has been devoted in some of the media that's preferred by Republican constituencies to demonize me, that it doesn't look real good socializing with me. Charlie Crist down in Florida, I think, testifies to that, and I think a lot of folks say, well, if we look like we're being too cooperative or too chummy with the president, that might cause us problems. That might be an excuse for us to get a challenge from somebody in a primary. So that tends to be the challenge. I promise you. We invite folks from Congress over here all the time. And when they choose to come, I enjoy their company. Sometimes they don't choose to come, and that has to do with the fact that I think they don't consider the optics useful for them politically. And ultimately, the way we're going to get stuff done, personal relationships are important. And obviously, I can always do a better job. And the nice thing is that now that my girls are getting older, they don't want to spend that much time with me anyway. So I'll be probably calling around looking for somebody to play cards with me or something, because I'm getting kind of lonely in this big house. So maybe a whole bunch of members of the House Republican Caucus want to come over and socialize more. But my suspicion is getting the issues resolved that we just talked about, the big stuff. Whether or not we get sensible laws passed to prevent gun violence, whether or not America's paying its bills, whether or not we get immigration reform done. All that's going to be determined largely by where the respective parties stand on policy, and maybe most importantly, the attitude of the American people. Now, if the American people feel strongly about these issues and they push hard and they reward or don't reward members of Congress with their votes, if they reject sort of uncompromising positions or sharp partisanship or always looking out for the next election, and they reward folks who are trying to find common ground, then I think you'll see behavior in Congress change. And that'll be true whether I'm the life of the party or a stick in the mud. All right? Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, so there he is, the president, nearly a one-hour news conference, wrapping through a lot of the most important issues on his agenda right now. This is his last formal news conference, we're told, in his first term as president of the United States. The inauguration, the formal official inauguration this coming Sunday. On Monday, all the pomp and ceremony here in the nation's capital. The most important issue is the economic issue, the U.S. economy, jobs. The president stating firmly, forcefully, as he has before, he will not negotiate with Congress when it comes to raising the nation's debt ceiling. What I will not do, the president said, is negotiate with a gun at the head of the American people. Very strong words from the president. He's clearly frustrated, clearly angry at the Republicans right now, threatening that he's not going to go ahead and let them try to use raising the nation's debt ceiling as leverage in getting further spending cuts. John King is here with us. Gloria Borger is here with us. Both of you stand by. Breonna Keeler was at the news conference. She's over there at the White House. Breonna, the president was very tough right now in offering his assessment on what needs to be done.
That's right, Wolf, and he said he will not negotiate on the debt ceiling, the end. He has reiterated that, and this was his chance to come out today and say it yet again. He said today that the United States is not a deadbeat nation, and the point that he was making, and I think we'll be hearing a lot more of, and we've heard some of in the past, is that he says that this is spending that has already taken place. He used an analogy where he talked about you go out for a meal at a restaurant and then you don't pay the bill. He's saying this is the equivalent of that. He was asked about the fact that Republicans, this really is one of their only cards to play at this point, but he said that it's irresponsible and it's absurd. And he was also asked as well, Wolf, about a couple of other topics, of course, gun violence, where he seemed to indicate that he already had Vice President Biden's recommendations that he should take. We were expecting these to come to the president tomorrow, but he already has these. He says he's reviewing them and that he'll sit down with Vice President Biden, and that later this week he'll be talking about the proposals that he wants to push. There's been some signs that the administration may not vigorously push for that assault weapons ban that we know President Obama, at least in principle, supports, but politically would be a very difficult lift for Congress. He sort of sidestepped whether that was something that he was going to move forward with, but said that there's a list of common sense proposals. And finally, Wolf, he was asked just one question about this criticism that he's received recently because of his top cabinet picks really lacking diversity, being all white men. There have not been women among them. He said, stay tuned for the other picks in his cabinet, that he thinks in the end he will have continued his tradition of having women in the White House and also on his cabinet. But for right now, some of that criticism still does persist, Wolf.
It does indeed. Breonna, stand by. John King, the president said if the Republicans don't go along and raise the nation's debt ceiling, Social Security recipients, their checks are going to go away. Veterans' benefits are going to go away. Inspectors who deal with loose nukes around, they're not going to be able to pay the bills. Investors around the world will lose their confidence in the U.S. economy, and the nation's debt, as a result, will increase. Those are pretty strong words from the president.
Strong words, and many of them familiar if you go back to this showdown 2 years ago. And he also said one of the results of the showdown 2 years ago was the United States having its credit rating downgraded. Look, there's no question. Repeated references to the election. I won was the president's message. Even though the majority of House Republicans were reelected, the president's message was look at the polls, look at the elections, I won. So Wolf, clearly on this debt issue, the spending issue, he believes at the moment he has the high ground. He said he will not not, quote, let the Republicans collect a ransom, essentially get more spending cuts from him in terms of the debt ceiling negotiations. He wants to keep them separate. Now, last time, and he was asked about this, he did agree to negotiate. But look down at that fight. Look down at that fight for a minute. You cannot leave this news conference optimistic. The Republicans are already issuing statements saying, sorry, Mr. President.